On this week's Bet the Process podcast, we have a very, very special guest. We have Michael Lewis, who is I think he's the best writer of our generation. He's certainly Rufus and I's favorite writer. So he's the official writer of the Bet the Process podcast. And this episode is sponsored by Novig, the only commission-free sports prediction market. On Novig, you can set your own odds and trade directly against other real users with no fees, increasing your chances of winning by 10 times in the long run. Ditch the against the house model where the odds are stacked against you and start winning bigger with Novig. So with that, let's start the process. Welcome to another episode of the Bet the Process podcast. I am fresh and back from the PGA show in Orlando. Rufus is fresh off of his solo podcasting career. Rufus, how did you enjoy doing the podcast alone and not having me there to interrupt you?
It's really hard, Jeff. I'm good at putting together like a sentence or two, and then I kind of like need someone arguably. And then I need someone to like rescue me from myself, because if there's nobody, then I have to like figure out how to like include.
Then you have like an awkward restart, and you say, "Oh, okay." So here's what I'm trying to say. So is that a good Rufus impression?
The good news about taping a podcast yourself is you can do multiple takes on the introduction. And so I did do that.
Nice.
I realized that I'm better if I had little notes of exactly what things I wanted to hit on. And then I could kind of go back and make sure. It helped with the transitions.
Have you done your $1,000 donation to Sandy Hook Promise yet? Because
no,
I think
I need to do
next week we'll be doing our props episode, which is always another new charity opportunity. Should we have both Judah and David Al on, or just Judah? Ultimately,
well, I say the more the merrier in a way, but let's.
But the thing is, we'll see whether David Al on. So, did you have any thoughts, reflections on the NFL games from last week?
Yeah, I did. I watched the entire first one, and then I watched half of the. I did not see the second half of Buffalo, Kansas City, sadly.
It wasn't like a good game or anything. So
no, not at all. Right?
I'm glad you turned that off.
I had a movie premiere I had to go to.
Oh, big time! What was it? Was it like did it have sound, or was it black and white?
No, these were documentaries. I was at Sundance.
Oh, you're so fancy.
Guess,
you should have. You should have. Our buddy Jan was there. By the way,
for a second. I'm going to do a Jeff and name drop. I watched the end of the second quarter and most of the third quarter in a restaurant in downtown Park City because I wanted to get some food and watch the game. And I ended up sitting next to John Hamm, and he and I basically just talked football. He was vocally cheering for the Redskins and yelling at referees. He's a Chiefs fan, but really hates the Eagles. So he was there with his wife, and he and I were just watching and talking football, and it was
Is
great.
his wife famous? Is she an actress?
I don't know if she's an actress.
Did you tell him who you were?
Well, he introduced himself. He says, hi, I'm John. And I said, I'm Rufus. And we didn't mention who each other were. I didn't say.
Did you act like you didn't know who he was?
I wouldn't say I acted like I didn't know who he was. I didn't.
His wife is Anna Osceola.
Is that?
The two were married in 2023 by Anderson Canyon in Big Sur, California.
Okay.
Well,
but look,
she's not bad looking.
I did ask if he had a film, if he was working on a film here or anything like that.
Did you tell them you loved him in Bridesmaids? Because that's his best role.
I did say that he has, or he did say that he has a narrative podcast that he's doing for Amazon that's kind of looks at like LA in the 1940s.
You should have. Did you tell him you had a podcast?
No. I mean, if he'd asked, I would have told him, but he didn't ask.
Why wouldn't you tell him? Like, people would find someone like John Hamm would find you way more interesting than you think.
Maybe, but if he doesn't ask, I'm not just going to volunteer that information. Like, clearly, look, I didn't want to disturb him. He's doing what he's doing. We were both kind of chatting about
watching. I would argue that more people would want to watch a football game with you than John Hamm.
I mean,
not me specifically. I would much rather watch the game with John Hamm. I've watched game,
So would
football game.
I. I have to watch every
But like
game with
I would
myself.
argue that like people would enjoy watching more. No one's gonna. Who wants to watch a football game with John Hamm? I mean, I
Well,
guess
he's not a sports isn't his career.
he's
Sports
in
betting
he's in
isn't
a
his career.
fantasy league with Bill Simmons. So I think he actually is
I
a
hope he can
is,
beat Bill Simmons. That's kind
is
of
a
like the
sports
minimum
junkie.
threshold. Beating Bill Simmons is like the minimum threshold of competency.
Bill Simmons, his sports betting takes just keep continuing to. They're really something. How did
Is
you
he
do?
like
Did you bet
becoming a
anything in those
character?
games?
Is he like an actor playing Bill Simmons now?
No, I mean he really.
He's just
The thing
leaned
about Bill
into.
Simmons is he's so like kind of organically the everyman fan, and his content is very entertaining to me because of that. But this goes back to like we're about to have Michael Lewis on, and actually it would be really interesting to ask him because I know that he knows Bill, but like has he ever heard Bill Simmons's takes on sports betting, right? Because ultimately I think it's a pretty fascinating thing to think about the role that mainstream media, like Bill Simmons is probably, I don't know, top five most influential people in all of sports media, and therefore one of the top five most influential people in all of sports betting.
There's
Because he,
certainly one of the top five most influential people in Jeff Ma's career, or Jeff Ma's to
you
Jeff
don't
Ma.
think you don't think he's a top five influential person in sports media?
I mean, I don't know.
Name four people more influential that can like if they
Pat
say
McAfee. Um, like the thing is,
McAfee's
I'm not
like
as
just become that, right?
no, McAfee's more relevant than Simmons. Simmons has been around longer, but Simmons is kind of yes, he's the everyman, but you have to realize your perspective here is as a Boston sports fan, and so Bill
It's
Simmons is
not
kind of
just that's like I'm not trying to pump any like I'm not trying to make Bill Simmons out to be more than he is. I think you are largely downplaying how many people listen to his podcast. And it's not just Boston sports fans that listen to his podcast. Like he has incredible people as guests too on his podcast. It's like
yeah,
I mean, McAfee
you have
fine right
McAfee, you have
now.
Barstool,
Okay, like pardon the interruption. I would argue that Simmons is more important than pardon the interruption.
maybe it's just a sad state of sports media now that kind of makes it the case.
Well, I mean, is it sad? I mean, did I got a text message on Monday with a link to Portnoy talking about how that game was fixed. And my friend was asking, "Do you think this game was fixed?" And I was like,
Of
"This
course
is
not.
absurd that people like listen to someone like Portnoy and believe that this game was fixed." Like those calls, like the first call that they missed where Kincaid probably got the first down and they didn't give it to him. They could have challenged that. That's not like it was unchallengeable, right? Like that was something they could have challenged if it was so clear to everyone, they should have just challenged that, right? Do you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah. But hold on. What you're saying kind of makes me think about just this whole notion that we have now that lots of things in society are rigged. And I mean, like there was this terrible plane crash that happened yesterday in Washington, D.C., where a commercial airliner collided with a Black Hawk helicopter, and it killed like 66 people. And you go on Twitter and you see people saying, "Well, it looks like this was intentional, like this was rigged. Were there celebrities on board? Like this definitely couldn't have been an accident." Blah blah blah. It's like we think everything is rigged now, and I'm kind of
I mean, the
curious.
problem is is that like there have been a lot of things, especially during the COVID like world where people thought like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, but they've proven to be right on some of these things.
But it's everybody's default is to assume a conspiracy, or not everybody's, but a vocal minority. And I'm kind of curious what Michael Lewis's take is on this, given that his podcast Against the Rules for 5 seasons has dealt with fairness in society.
Well, we can talk to him about it.
We
We
will.
can ask him about it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if going back to the Portnoy thing, I just think what's really funny about what's happening with the Chiefs right now is it is exactly, and I get to view it as a like third party. It's exactly what happened with the Patriots. They got so good that everyone just started, wanting to say that they were cheating, wanted to say that things were rigged for them, and people like largely hating them and looking for like confirmation bias theories on, how they're cheating or how they're like getting unfair treatment. And
Well, the
it's
Patriots were deflating footballs. Don't forget that.
that's never been proven. Go look it up.
Okay.
Go look. I mean, serious. Go look it up. It's just like anything. Go
It's a
go look it up.
conspiracy.
The only thing that was proven was that they did video other people's practices. Right
Okay.
there was proof there, but it was the deflate thing was never. I mean,
But they might have been filming practices just to see what uniforms they were wearing so they could get their color scheme properly set up.
if that's your version of humor, which I think it is, then we're all in touch.
I'm just
All
saying
right.
you can't say that they were. I mean, you would say, well, you can't say they were videotaping the practices to gain any kind of advantage. That part hasn't been proven.
All right, let's welcome in Michael Lewis to the About the Process podcast, and we'll talk to you guys all again next week when we will have Judah Fortgang on and maybe some other people to talk through props with the prop king, Rufus Peabody.
Can we call Judah now like a recurring guest?
Whatever we want to call him. He's like a really good guest, that's all.
He's
We'll
great.
call him a really good guest.
I like that.
We now welcome in Michael Lewis to the Bet the Process podcast. We're in the midst of a story, so we're going to go right into that story that Michael was telling about a heartfelt text from Rufus.
Well, so Rufus and Jeff just appeared on my screen. I was just telling Rufus, who is maybe the main character of the last season of my podcast, that I got this text last week. It was a multi-part text, and it was so moving. It was like, it started out, our interaction last year was among the most meaningful I've had in a long time. I've reflected on it and whatever, and I got it, and it was from Rufus. And it said Rufus. And so the whole time I'm thinking, oh, it's Rufus Peabody. This is slightly out of character, but not too. I was really touched. Rufus has this slice of spirituality and meaning. And I thought, well, he's like, this is great. I had a little tear in my eye. And then I realized that there's another Rufus whose podcast I was on, who somehow his contact details were merged into yours. So actually your picture came up when his cell phone came up. And so I got myself into this state of mind about you. I was about to text you back and say, well, actually, I feel the same way. It was, and then I thought, fuck him. It wasn't Rufus at all. He didn't say any of this. I'm not texting him back to say that.
Oh, that is awesome.
Who was this Rufus?
His name is Rufus Griscom, and he has a great podcast. It's really great. I think it's called The Big Idea. He's a fabulous interviewer. And it was, it was just to sit down 2 hours in his little session in Tribeca. But I spent about 3 minutes in a frame of mind thinking you had written all this. And I just thought, and it was just so, I was feeling so sweetly towards you. And then I realized it wasn't you, and I had to erase all that.
Oh.
And it was painful. It was painful because I wished you had written it.
This is painful for me to hear, Michael, except now I want to know who this Rufus is, and I would like to. Can you introduce me to him, please?
Totally.
He lives in Tribeca. Like,
Yeah.
I would love
Rufuses.
to. I've never been friends with another Rufus.
And
Then I will really have something to be grateful.
I will when we're done. I will introduce you by text, and you will hit it off. He's a good college friend of Jacob Weisberg, who was the founder of Pushkin, and who's responsible for my podcast happening in the first place. So I don't know how it happened, but I ended up in the studio. But the text, it was funny. It was funny because I was so willing to believe it was you. And it wasn't that far off. It was the sort of thing, if you'd had a couple of drinks in you at midnight, you might have drunk texted me. I really love being on the podcast, whatever.
Rufus has had those moments, I know, like, or especially around the holidays, where he'll send me a text message that says, I really appreciate our friendship, or something of that sort. But maybe it wasn't actually Rufus. Maybe it was this other Rufus sending it to me. So who knows?
I do think it's good to like having that kind of gratitude and like reflecting on the people in your life is actually like really, really healthy. And when I've done that, it makes me feel really good.
Me too. No, it wasn't that far off from something you would have done. It was something you would have done.
Well, the problem is now I can't do it.
No, you
I
can't
feel like
do
this
it.
is an episode
Yeah,
of
it's totally
Seinfeld.
contrived now.
This is
No,
definitely
you
an
can't
episode
do
of
it.
Seinfeld.
I'll
It's
just
like
take
embarrassing.
I'll just assume you would have. but this is true. There is value in every now and then taking a deep breath and just like appreciating these people who you formed bonds with. It's completely true, and I don't do it enough. But I'm of course appreciative when other people do. Anyway,
Okay.
what are we talking?
That's an interesting segue into. I'm kind of curious about the bonds you formed with people in that you've written about, and do you still keep in touch with them? And I know Jeff kind of had a little more he wanted to say on this, but
Shall I start? Because
yeah, we can build off of that because I think it's an interesting topic to start with.
All I would say, I think it's true that there's no major character in any of my books that's not still in my life. And there are a bunch of people from the podcast who are also still in my life. The books are more in, there's a lot more human interaction with the book, especially if there's a main character book. I mean, I just move into their lives for a year. So you name the character, Billy Bean, the characters from The Big Short, Charity Dean, go all the way back to Jim Clark and the new thing. I just got an email from him yesterday. That they getting to know someone in the way I need to get to know them to write them well. That people are, I think, even with their spouses, seldom on the other end of that kind of curiosity, like who you are and why. Even in marriages, people kind of get to a point where they just stop. I kind of basically know you. It's good enough. Where that's not true when I'm writing about someone. Now, in the case of you and my podcast, Rufus, we had some of that, but you just could be a pal forever. I mean, I could tell when I met you, like I just liked you, and we were going to be whatever happened in the podcast that we would be friends. And I felt that way with Jeff when I met Jeff, but that's different. These are relationships that were formed because I was writing about someone who I might not typically end up in a close relationship, but because of the process of writing about them, I build relationships. I'll tell you what, I'll finish with this. I once saw a movie. It's called Big Fish. Did you ever see this? I think Albert Finney was in it and Ewan McGregor. And the conceit was the main character was a big flamboyant personality guy from the South. He was a salesman, and he would come back to his little kids after a sales trip and tell them about all these characters he'd met. And they were fabulous. It seemed like they were inventions. They were Siamese twins, and there was the tallest man in the world. And he'd been out in the world, and he'd come back and he'd have all these stories about these people he'd met. And the movie is about his death and the son going home and ruminating on like how my dad made the world more interesting than it actually was and how much fun that was as a little kid. And he's going home for the funeral. And he gets to the funeral and all these characters appear. The tallest man in the world, the Siamese twins, all these people he thought the dad, as a grown-up, he thought the dad must have just invented, were actually in the dad's life and remained in the dad's life and turned up at the dad's funeral. When I saw that movie, I thought, that's me. I move through the world, I meet all these great characters. And if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, and I tell my kids about them, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, they'll all be at my funeral, and the kids will say, "Oh, they did exist. He didn't just make them up."
So it's a good question about this. Like when you say you get to know people and you get to know them in a certain way, and I think you and I have talked a little bit about the concept of how close you can get to a subject and still be objective. When you reflect back on some of the ways that the people that you've written about have evolved or their personas have evolved, how does that impact the way that you think about the way you wrote about them? Does it ever make you think like, God, I wish I had written differently? Or do you think like, well, I wrote about them in the way that I wrote them at the time, they've changed since then, or any of that sort? And obviously there's SBF, there's Michael Orr, there's the people that have had challenges since you've written about them.
Well, SBF had his challenges before I wrote about him. He was in jail when I started my book. Sure. So there was no real mystery there. I would say, this is going to sound funny, but so Michael Orr was whatever he was, 18 years old when he was in The Blind Side in the book, 19. He was a freshman at Ole Miss, I think, when the book came out. So he was kind of not fully formed in some ways. And he wasn't although he's at the center of the book, he's not typical. He's not like the main character of the book. Like it's sort of like all the forces around him are what the book is about, less than him. So I had no great expectations for how he would emerge, except, I mean, if you want to go back and look at that book, the one thing it assumed about him was that he was going to be a professional football player. And basically, my sample size, all my observations were from him in high school. And I thought the thing that might not happen was, oh, he's just been wildly overrated. Like that won't happen. And the fact that he kind of moved on and fulfilled his destiny to be not quite an NFL left tackle. He had a couple of years as a left tackle. He wasn't quite that. I thought that was kind of amazing that happened. And it wasn't prescience on my part. It was like, oh, that's what was supposed to happen, and it happened. The person who's changed the most since the book was published, and I look at him and I say, I couldn't write that character now. Like he's different, is Billy Beane. Billy Beane has mellowed so much. I mean, there used to be this kind of anger is not quite the right word, but it's not the wrong word. There's a fire there, like a little volatility. Like it felt like every now and then there was and you get a chaw, he chew tobacco, his face would get a little red, and you just think, oh shit, it's going to explode. It's like sitting next to the Vesuvius. And he has none of that now. There's this chillness about him. And there's something's happened there. So I see, it is true that sometimes these characters like change some, and then they aren't exactly the character I wrote. If I wrote about him now, I'd write about him different than I wrote about him then. But for the most part, although the things happen in the world, between them and the world, that are maybe a little different from what happened when I was writing about them, they don't seem all that different. The people who when you say, oh, like that's different from the book, are the Big Short characters. Because they were all right about something, right? They were all smart about the subprime bubble, and subsequently, most of them have had their comeuppance in the market. And so if your takeaway from the book was, oh, Michael Lewis thinks they're geniuses and they can predict the future about anything, that it wasn't what I thought. But if you thought that from the book, you'd be disappointed with what happened to them afterwards, because they got a lot of things wrong.
Well, the people, most of the time, the people that get the things right are, I mean, it's some skill but also a lot of luck. And I mean,
yeah. And at any moment of disaster in the financial markets, there's going to be someone who predicted it, and they're not going to be the same person who predicts it the next time. What makes them interesting is when they have a process, apropos of your podcast title, when they have a process that led them to the right answer. And so the process is in some way revealing about the world. The point isn't these people are geniuses and they're going to be able to predict the future over and over. The point is the way they were thinking about this particular problem helps us think about this particular problem. And maybe they won't do it the next time, but they did it this time. But all kinds of things happen to these characters and that I have no control over. And if I went back, so Michael Orr, he's the most controversial because he sued the family. But you do know the truth of this story is pretty simple. Michael Orr thought there was millions of dollars the Tuohy's family made off the movie, and told them that if he didn't get his share of those millions of dollars, that he was going to trash their reputation. They said, rightly, there weren't millions of dollars. Now, I know this because they got a half of my deal. So I know exactly how much money they got. They got half of what I got. And they split it up evenly among the kids, including Michael. And so Michael then proceeded to do this, and has made a big noise in the newspaper. But the charge that he they stole his money is kind of insane. If I go back and I think about the character I wrote, would I have predicted the lack of gratitude? Or would I have predicted the anger? Probably not, but I wouldn't have thought much about it. It wasn't central to the story. Like what was central to the story was that it wasn't even their motives, actually. It wasn't like, oh, they're just nice people. It was just the power of, for whatever reason, some rich family takes in some poor kid, how transformative that is, for whatever reason they're doing it. And I thought if you were going to go at the Tuohys back then, the thing that made me just slightly uncomfortable, not really, but just slightly, like in terms of their motives. The idea that they wanted money from him was insane. They were, they had $100 million and they were generous as the days long. They weren't like in it to exploit him for money, but they did want him to go to Ole Miss to play football. He did go to Ole Miss to play football. And the curious thing about the whole drama is that he has not accused them of sort of like twisting his arm to go to Ole Miss. He's never whispered a word of that. He still says, I went there because I wanted to go there. If you'd asked me, why am I worried about this relationship? It would have been the same reason the NCAA was worried about the relationship back then. Yeah. But would I have thought, oh, Michael Orr will at some point turn on them and feel like he was exploited? I don't think I'd have had a strong view. I'd have thought that's unlikely, but it's not central. It's not central to him. It's sort of like you read that story and you read him. Character's capable of doing that. When he walks into the Broadcast School, he's looking at it quite cynically. That character is capable of that, but I wouldn't have seen I wouldn't have thought it, and it didn't really change what happened. He went from being this kid nobody valued to this kid everybody valued, and that was what was interesting.
Can we go back to Billy? Because I think this is an interesting thing. If you read, so you would say like, oh, Billy has been validated, right? At some level, like people paying him $250,000 to speak to them for 45 minutes probably makes him validated about his ideas and thoughts, right? But the validation you would have thought would have been for him winning a World Series, like finally having that whole thing happen. And the A's have gone the other direction, really. So how do you think he has found that calm? Like, what's your clinical assessment of how he's found that calm, through the last few years when his team has largely struggled?
Yeah. Well, it's not his team anymore.
Right. But I mean, the team that he was.
But yes. Yeah. So I'm not going to put words in his mouth. This is me talking, not him. So one, validation. It's true. I don't know if the calm comes from a validation. I just observe the calm, but I do sense he's like, whatever was making him upset or frustrated when I was working on the book started to vanish. And I think one of the big things that happened was the Red Sox won the World Series, doing basically what he was doing with more money. That it was a process that was validated rather than, it was like this approach to running a baseball team. It's not just, everybody stole it, some version of it. So nobody would say, oh, what he was doing was not smarter.
Or so you gave it away.
Yeah, I gave it away.
Writing about it.
Yeah, I gave it away by writing about it. But he would have said, and I don't think wrongly, that it's going to go, everybody's going to pick it up anyway at that point, and the reason was John Henry had just bought the Red Sox, and John Henry was trying to hire Billy to run the Red Sox. And Theo Epstein was also working with John Henry to try to talk Billy into moving from the A's. And when Billy said no, they turned to Theo to do the same thing, but with money. So Billy looked at it and said, they're going to do it. The cat's out of the bag. And Billy would also say the only thing Moneyball did is maybe accelerated a bit, that this was going to happen. There was going to be an analytics revolution in baseball, but that he didn't ever win a World Series, I don't sense that eats at him. I could be wrong. I don't sense he even thinks about it. I think he really does believe that, like, you get in the playoffs and it's like a crapshoot kind of thing. And the team, I think he would say two things. I would say two things. One is, when you have no money and you have an intellectual advantage, there's hope. When you have no money and you have no intellectual advantage, there's less hope. It's not that you can't still win with no money, but just I would love someone to do a study. Like, it seems like it's getting harder, and it certainly has gotten harder for the A's. And then there's the whole matter of the ownership. And I can remember having a conversation with either him or someone in the front office when John Fisher wouldn't let them re-sign Marcus Semien to a pretty steep hometown discount. Semien he was clearly worth a lot more than they were offering him for like the next 3 years. And And John Fisher didn't want to do it. And I remember the tone on the other end of the phone. It was the first time I heard this. I thought, we can't do this. If he won't let us do this, we'll never win. And there was a kind of giving up. It was like the owners they'd always been kind of tight-fisted with him, but they'd always listened to him. And there came a moment where this owner just stopped listening to them. So why the owner keeps him around, I don't know. I think that there's a kind of like, what can we do? Not only are we at a disadvantage, you're not let us even fight with what we can fight with. So I don't think he like looks at the A's and thinks that's my failure. He might, but I don't think so. And if you'd asked me, in fact, people did ask me back in like 2004, what's going to happen? I'd have said the A's were doomed because their edge is gone. And I don't know, maybe there'll be some other edge to find, but I don't know what it is. It turns out there were some
There's
other
a lot
edges.
of edges to find.
Yeah, there were.
Player development.
That's right. That's what they missed. They missed player development.
Player development stuff.
And that was interesting why they missed that.
Well, because of Billy's career, right?
Yeah.
Because Billy thought that guys couldn't.
Guys.
This is who you were.
That's right. It's sort of like the data you don't change who a person is. You just change your understanding of the person. That's exactly right. But it's also true that unlike their edge that they had back in that day with analytics, player development would have required a bigger investment. And it's funny, it's funny. The other thing that's odd that they missed that thing is that Sandy Alderson didn't miss it. Sandy, who was before Billy, I don't know if you remember this. There's like a little section in the book where Sandy says basically nobody's moving up a level in minor leagues unless you walk one at every 10 at bats. Quit hitting home runs. You're not impressing us. Like, I want to see the walks. I want to see the plate discipline. And sure enough, players started behaving differently at the plate. So that showed you could change the way a player played.
Incentives.
That's right. But in addition, you're right. Analytics hit player development, and that was something other people got and they did not get. There were other edges. But
you've toyed around with the idea of writing like a Moneyball too. I know you and I have talked about it. Is that something that's ever going to happen, or like how has your framing changed as time about writing that second act?
I sold it as 2 books. I mean, I have an email somewhere where I said to the publisher late at night, I'd come home from being with the A's, and I wrote him, I said, sit down, take a deep breath. I mean, not even writing a sports book struck me as like, it's going to be a hard sell to the publisher. But I said 2 books. First one's called Moneyball, and it's about this thing they're doing. And I gave him a paragraph on the thing. And the second book is called Underdogs, and it's about the guys they drafted. And they're each little science experiments. They drafted them with stats rather than with their scouts' judgment. And we'll follow them through the minor leagues. And I spent 2 or 3 years working on Underdogs. And I had a sense I should have listened to it earlier. This is like people that I have this vice, maybe not as bad as a lot of people, but I still have it. I don't ignore sunk cost. But I spent so much time on it. I kept spending time on it. And what happened was Moneyball went boom. All of a sudden, there are all these people writing about sports kind of the way Moneyball wrote about sports. And not that there wasn't anybody before. I mean, the Baseball Prospectus guys were there, and there was always, but it kind of went mainstream. And it felt like there was nothing I was going to be able to say that hadn't been said by someone before by the time I got a book out. It felt like there was no original intellectual material. There was quite good anecdotal material. Like the stories that came out of the minor leagues were fabulous. But I just could never figure out what the point of the book was, because it seemed like it had been written already. And it kind of had. So where that impulse in me, like, oh, I hit this vein of ore, is fantastic. Incredibly lucky. I found this vein of ore, this gold. I got to write Moneyball. The way I finished working in the mine was not in baseball. I wrote about Shane Battier, and I wrote about basketball. I wrote about football. But all just in magazine length kind of things. And I don't see how I come back to sports that way. I'd love to come back to sports, especially now, since everything you write outside of sports, one way or another, gets politicized, and it's either for Democrats or Republicans. Sports is like the one thing that cuts across the culture. I would love to find a sports subject. And I have vague ideas, but I have not figured out how to do it. I told you about that. I think I probably told you about this on a walk.
Yeah.
There's something to do with quarterbacks, like how poorly they get projected, like that all these resources get thrown into figuring out which college quarterback is going to be a pro quarterback, and they don't seem any better right now than they were 50 years ago. And there's um, there's also something to do with the professionalization of sports at a younger and younger age. So right now, I'm gonna about to go see a 15-year-old quarterback. I'm not gonna tell you who he is or where he is, but he's the best in his class, who's got $1 million NIL deal. He's just coming out of his sophomore year in high school, and I'm gonna go see if maybe he's a ticket to a story. But the odds are not great. I just don't know what the book would be. Um, but I miss it. I love writing about sports.
Well, speaking of odds and sports, can we use that to sort of segue into your podcast?
And you, the
well,
main
not
character of the
me, but
podcast.
I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about the sports betting world and
Yeah.
and your sort of journey
can we
in learning
actually,
about it.
Rufus, can we actually segue this way? I would love to see, because we, like everything that Michael does is character driven, right? It starts with a character and a concept. And you are the character in this case. And so it's very rare that you have the opportunity to like talk to the writer and talk to the subject in this way. I would love to hear, Michael, like as you think about Rufus broadly and you compare him to a Billy or to a Michael Burry, like how do you think about just the general skill set? Like what is, I guess, what do you find spectacular about Rufus that makes him successful
This isn't
comparing
about me.
to, yeah, it wasn't,
No.
We're making it very
the podcast. It wasn't
uncomfortable.
about me. It was about the industry.
Yeah,
but we
And
will
I was your jungle guide,
Rufus,
yes,
we will
but-
segue into the industry.
So we'll do this. We'll do this in a painless way, Rufus.
Yeah.
It's a painless way. I'll do it really clinically and antiseptically. Rufus as a character, it's fabulous that he comes from Yale, and he comes from upper middle class America, not the kind of place that's going to generate a professional gambler. So that when Rufus hits Vegas and pro gambling, he's different than it. And so that's very valuable in the character. Rufus has also got dimensions to him, that there's a part of Rufus that wants more meaning in his life than he gets from just gambling. And you sense that in everything he says. You could just in the way he talks. And what I mean by that is you don't hear there's not a patness or a defensiveness about what he has to say about what he does. He's sort of open to like other things. You hear it in his voice. So that makes him a really good character. And then he's a good explainer. Like I wasn't, unlike your podcast, mine isn't really about sports gambling in the sense I'm not teaching people how to do it really. I'm not suggesting good bets. But I did need to get across like what it is that someone who actually knows what they're doing does. And he explains things very well. So that helped a lot. There's basic decency to him. Like I feel very uncomfortable. The podcast is different from books. So I didn't have to spend as much time with Rufus doing the podcast as I would have if I'd written a book about him. It was 1/20th the time, but we still spent time together. But I find with people I write about, there is some basic level of liking them. I have to like them enough to want to be with them, or else I just won't do the job. And I can like a lot of different kinds of people, but there are some kinds of people I just can't like. I just don't like. Like if you said, Michael, Elon Musk wants you to move into his life and write a book about him, I'd say no, thank you. Like I know I can spend about an hour with him. I find him repellent, and I do find people that I just don't want to be with them. And I can't write about him then. So with Rufus, it was like hanging with Rufus. He's fun to hang with. And that really helps. Really helps.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question about Rufus, and then we can move on to the sports betting part. He and I argue a lot on the show about his ability to do other things besides sports betting. I think you would probably agree with me that there's lots of things in the world that he would be successful at besides sports betting.
Sure.
My question to you would be, after you've seen all these things, if you were doing a career intervention with Rufus, what would you tell him to go do?
I mean, so am I allowed to ignore how much he gets paid?
Sure.
I mean, money's not an issue here.
Yeah.
So I don't have to find him a job that pays him as
I
well
know
as
what
the
you're going to
job.
say then.
Yeah, he knows what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's a
What's
teacher. I think he should be teaching.
We've had this talk.
And so I think he'd be a fabulous teacher. And I think there are ways to do it where it actually would be big time. Like you'd be masterclass kind of stuff. Like a lot of people listening, not just a classroom, but I think you get a lot of it out of a classroom. So that would be one thought. I mean, the natural thing would be like, I don't know, high frequency trading or something, but why do that?
Doesn't sound interesting.
No, it sounds boring. Um, but anything, look, you both could be dropped into a political campaign and be enormously useful. So your thing, there are lots of places where I could imagine dropping you both and you being useful. But I feel like Rufus has a thing, he needs something slaked inside him. There's some feeling of like ultimate meaning that he's not getting out of his life, maybe not out of his life, but out of his job. And I think he'd get it if he were teaching people. And I have to think about how broadly what that means. Like maybe there are a lot of different ways to teach people. But I could imagine him as a very successful teacher.
I think it would need to be a personal thing, though. I do think I'm missing that because sports betting is fairly impersonal. I'm not actually. I'm not. If I'm impacting people, it's not like in a personal way.
Right.
As much so.
I understand that. Although you changed LJ's life.
Yeah, her boyfriend hates me, right? Right.
That's probably flattering.
That could go. Yeah.
It's a.
Well, can we just say that he hates me because he didn't like the fact that she was sports betting?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if he hates you, but yes, I think everybody's a little suspicious of like the relationship, and it was. But anyway, so that's what I would do. I would make him go. I'd have him go teach for a few weeks at a high school. I'd have him guest lecture in a high school math class where they're teaching calculus. And we're going to pause on the calculus. Instead, we're going to have 3 weeks of sports gambling. And it's a way of getting statistics across to them and see just how excited the kids were not to have to listen to a calculus teacher and listen to Rufus for 3 weeks.
I'll tell you, the problem is it's not competitive enough. Like I coached sailing. I sailed in college and I coached sailing in summers. And I loved that because there was that scoreboard. Like, I mean, I guess there's the scoreboard of how the kids do on tests, but like, I feel like, but seeing the kids improve and really, I don't know, like
here you go.
It was super rewarding. It was a job I absolutely loved.
This should be the equivalent of the old prep quiz bowl where kids would get on TV and answer trivia questions and schools would compete against each other. And it was just rote memorization. It could be a sports gambling competition. Wouldn't have to be real money.
I trained them for sports betting, the national sports betting national championship.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Presented by DraftKings.
Yes,
that already happened. But
okay, can we segue? This is an interesting point that you were making about LJ's boyfriend hating you, because ultimately one of the challenges, and I think one of the things I liked about your podcast a lot, Michael, was just some of the ways that you talked about the sort of hazards of sports betting. And I was literally listening to something the other day about someone that stopped sports betting. And one of the things they said is like, it definitely never made me a better parent. It definitely never made me a better, friend or husband. And so like, it's interesting to think about the hazards that you saw around sports betting in terms of what it does to the social dynamic of someone's life.
Well, I would first start with not just sports betting, but sports betting in the current environment. It's such a toxic, predatory environment. It's FanDuel and DraftKings. I mean, it's unbelievable. It blew my mind. To you, it's just, this, and you just assume this is the way the world is. It blew my mind how efficiently they figure out if you know what you're doing and get rid of you from their books if you don't know what you're doing. That Rufus can't really get his bets down as Rufus. I thought it's outrageous. Sort of violates some sense of fair play. And it's sort of like, we only want you if you're bad at this. And if you're really bad at this, we really want you, and we're gonna cultivate you. It's such a gross predatory relationship. Like you're only going to be in it if it's bad for you. So tell me if this is dumb. I got asked, I was on stage a few months ago at a corporate conference, and all the people in the audience were people who gave money to money managers. It was like big pension funds, that kind of, that university endowments. And the guy asked me a question I didn't see coming, like, how would you evaluate someone if they came into your office and they said they wanted to manage your money? And it popped into my head. Here's a new one for you. I'd ask them if they had an account in good standing at either FanDuel or DraftKings, and if they did, never give them a nickel. Like that, in a way, these sports books are identifying the people who should never be allowed to make investment decisions. And so this is one thing. The way we've designed the environment right now is really awful. And it just feels gross. But you're asking a slightly different question. It's
wait. Can I interrupt really quickly and just say, do you know that sort of meme where there's the bell curve and it's like the really dumb person's on one side and the really smart person's on the other side, but they have the same exact belief, right? I think you could say that with whether they had a DraftKings or FanDuel account in good standing. It's like if you're really dumb, you do, but if you're really smart, you also do because you've learned to play that game.
Yeah, but it's not your name.
No, if you've learned to keep an account, I mean, if you learn to keep an account in good standing despite having the best of it, I think that's kind of like.
Well, that would be amazing, but that seems to be very hard. You don't have one.
Hey, I have a VIP Bet Rivers account right now. All I do is throw in parlays, plus EV parlays, an hour before game time.
Okay, if you explain to me that you game the system and that's why you had an account, okay. You have me, but for the vast majority, they've sifted the population for people who should not be making bets. But the question you're asking, Jeff, was a harder one. It's like the just the activity, gambling on sports. Does it what's the effect it has on your life? I don't have any gamblers in my life except briefly my son Walker. We gave him $5,000 and expected him to go vaporize it, it was just like watching him. It was like all the problems we have with him on his phone all of a sudden were doubled. It was like this obsessive compulsive activity that gave him these little chemical rewards, and he took him just outside of our whatever we were doing as a group whenever he was doing it. But that's a 17-year-old boy gambling on his phone. I can't imagine. I've never heard anybody say gambling is good for your relationships. In fact, someone in the podcast, Rufus's Rufus's predecessor, Roxy Roxborough, went on at some length with me about how it's just it's bad for everything.
He said it doesn't make you a better person, but I always say sports betting has made me a better human being.
Oh, well, I'd love to hear that. How so?
It's made me understand that it's made me see the world probabilistically. It made me sort of see the process behind things more, because it's made me very process oriented. You have to be process oriented to succeed in sports betting. Yeah, I think the people that are successful in most industries are very process oriented. But I feel like I'm that way in my interactions with people. And so if I sort of view someone's intent as their process in a way, and so it makes me a lot more understanding and accepting of other people.
Oh, that's interesting. I would have thought you had that probabilistic outlook before you got to sports betting.
You know, I'm sure I did to some extent, but I think it's certainly exacerbated it.
That's interesting. Looking at other people as a distribution as opposed to a fixed point is one way of thinking about that, right? You're not just what you just did, you're that and lots of other things.
Well, it's like what happened didn't have to happen. Like,
yep.
Someone spilled water on me or wine on me or something like that. You know, that was a random thing.
Right.
And when there's a delay, when a flight gets canceled and you see all these people yelling at the poor gate agent, I go up to them. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I know this isn't your fault. Like, it's not.
But it's hard for me to believe, Rufus, that sports betting is what made you realize that. I'm curious, Michael, what positive attributes did you see in sports bettors, that are applicable, like successful sports bettors? What were the most positive attributes you saw of them?
I didn't spend that much time with many others but Rufus, but I spent a little bit of time. And the thing I liked the best about them was the way they tried to dig. And I'm talking about the ones who, they're different kinds of successful sports bettors. I'm not talking the ones who like pick off books that have the wrong price. That's one kind of thing. But the kind of thing that Rufus likes to do is finding things that are out about the sport, like fundamental research into what's going on in a sport and sort of getting to the root causes of things. It's a Moneyball like thing. I love that. I love all the million little insights that they have as a result of that. That I don't know, like home field advantage is more important in the first half than the second half. These sorts of things I find riveting, and the gambling incentive created by sports gambling pushes people's minds to go there, and that was my favorite thing of all. And I wished if I were doing a different sort of podcast, I would have devoted like a whole episode to all the insights generated by gamblers that other people had not seen. But because I mean, a lot of it, it's of use only to gamblers, but not all of it. Some of it's to be used to people who run teams.
Well, you talked about that with Roxy in baseball.
That's right.
In the 1980s, I guess.
But like nobody was, when people were trying to predict how many runs were going to be scored, nobody was paying attention to how big the ballpark was or where the wind was blowing from. And I mean, that's now, pretty rudimentary stuff. But at the time, it's really interesting to it's what it is. It's thinking thinking about sport, because mostly people just feel about sport. And so it's just the thinking that goes on in the smart gambler's mind. That kind of gambler, that's by far the most attractive to me trait, and the trait that's fun to encourage.
Yeah, I mean, there's this notion that we've talked about on this podcast of doing a series like called Seeking Alpha, which is essentially like the constant search for edge. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to the story of like Billy Beane and the notion of like, oh, okay, well, all the edge is gone. Well, it's not, right? Because ultimately, like if you look at what the Orioles did or what the Red Sox are trying to do, where they're trying to focus a lot on the idea of like developing players and using that as the new frontier. When you look back to sports betting and whatnot, what are what were the interesting things that you saw in terms of people being good at trying to find new edges? Like what's that? And I think for Rufus, it's just this natural intellectual curiosity he has to like figure things out. But were there other skills that you saw people that were that were interesting attributes in being able to seek alpha, and even maybe across some of the other subjects that you've talked about, or because there is that theme a little bit in your work of people seeking alpha?
How do people look for edge? So in sports gambling, I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer, because all the professional sports gamblers who I talked to, some of them didn't make it into the podcast. None of them were as interesting as Rufus, with a possible exception of a person we call Beckett. But he was interesting for different reasons.
Beckett is so interesting.
But I don't find Spanky's approach to, I mean, I love Spanky, but it's like, his approach to gambling, like when he starts out that there are a million different books and the prices are different and you're just arbing the books. I mean, okay, so what? It's just like, that's not that interesting. So Rufus would be my, like, all I have in terms of an edge finder in the sports gambling markets right now. And Rufus didn't reveal too many of his secrets to me. But how he's like, I don't follow golf, but just how he's talking about golf, like how this, classifying different courses and figuring out if this player plays a different way on this kind of course versus this kind of course, the various things he was doing, it just like he was thinking about it. And so so I'm not going to be helpful with like on the subject of sports gambling, how you find edge. More generally, all right, here would be here's my attempt at an interesting answer. I think people find edge who just think about the world differently, generally, who are just coming at it from a different angle. And they might not even be thinking they're looking for edge. They might not even realize what they found, but they just like are looking at something fresh and go, oh, I want to know who saw DeepSeek coming. That talk about a source of edge. If you had found it, if you realize that, like, oh my God, it's time, it's time to shorten a video. That the kind of person who gets there is someone who's just not listening to what everybody else is saying and thinking, and kind of like not even not dismissing it because it's not even getting to them. They're just looking at the world differently. I do it with story. Like I'm not looking for market edge. I'm looking for story edge. But it's just like when I'm at my best, I'm coming to a story and I'm without preconceptions or ignoring everybody else's preconceptions about a person or a situation. Uh, like the preconception that nothing that happens in Oakland is interesting because they haven't won a World Series. Um, and and just ignoring it and following my own sense of, oh no, this is what's interesting. This is the story. And you may think I'm an idiot for thinking this, but that encourages me because it means that what I'm thinking might be original. You're dismissing it. So it's almost a predisposition in the way you move through the world. It's like a kind of, you don't, whatever the gene is that causes people to behave like sheep, that do what everybody else does and feel more comfortable, to be comfortable in crowds, to all that. You don't have that. You have this other thing.
Well, you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned this notion of like you have sunk cost bias, but not as much as everyone else. And sunk cost bias is a lot of the reasons that people aren't willing to challenge things from a different perspective because they've spent all this, they have all this capital, like this intellectual capital, and believing things are the way they are. In the industry that I'm in the golf industry right now, which I work in, like these people have been doing the same thing for the last 25 years. So the idea that there's a better way or a new way of doing things challenges all of that, experience that they've had, rather than thinking about how do I take this experience that I've had and challenge how things were done to make things, better. And so I do think there's the big opportunity for edge when you're able to take, your experience and not make it sunk cost, but instead make it, a treasure trove of information or something. I don't know.
Mm.
So
I mean, you're asking me a question that you're more suited to answer than I am because you think about this more. But I do think I think the most valuable thing I do in response to that question is like personalize it to me. How do I find edge in what I do? And it is really clear the way I find edge is to not be kind of just like processing the world the way people want me to process it my own way. And when I find something that I feel some conviction about or some idea about, if the whole world thinks it's wrong, take it as a signal that it's right. Like take it as a good thing rather than a bad thing. Now, I see people when they in conversation in their social life looking to make sure that how they are conforms to the world around them in some way, that there's agreement rather than disagreement. Finding a seam of disagreement is so valuable. Finding something that nobody else thinks is important and you think is important, that's like the gold in what I do. And so it's sort of like it's probably like a psychological predisposition to start with, but realizing that that's valuable and encouraging it in yourself. Being in opposition, apart from the crowd, in what seems to be a risky place, but the risky place is actually the best place. That's how I think about like the advantages I have when I'm going about looking for stories. It's that I'm very comfortable in the place where I'm all by myself. And when I haven't had a book it's going to sound implausible, but it's true. I haven't had a book that I've written where if someone at a dinner party before I wrote it asked me what I was working on and I told them, their eyes would either glaze over or they'd say, oh, that's dumb, or not. Or you could see them thinking like, this is not interesting. Because it didn't feed into some preconception they had.
I take who would think a book about high frequency trading would be interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like,
how the stock market or how the stock market works now. Yeah. It's like, why do I want to know how the stock market works? Who cares? So anyway, I don't know. What do you think? Let me throw the question right back at you. What do you think causes people? Where do you find edge? If you're going to do a podcast about this, do you have must have some notion?
It's all,
I think there's like,
all incentives.
It's like, I think it's, no, I mean, I don't think it is incentives. I think it's like, if I think about you and how you find edge, it's intellectual curiosity. It's this challenge. It's like you're competitive. You want to find something that no one else has. I do think this idea of the way that you talk about, Michael, of being okay being alone, on your street corner with an opinion, and that's interesting, and that's the way that you get edge in writing. But again, like that's partially like bucking convention and being, okay with. I think it's the ability, the desire to question things. I think it's the desire to like search and just keep searching until you find something. Um, and then I think you have to be creative. Like I think like just the idea of, like again, and probably willing to have a lot of bad ideas at times because not all your ideas are going to be good.
Right.
And then probably a vetting process for those bad ideas so that you quickly run away from them, right? Like in the startup world, you spend so much time chasing different ideas and you want to quickly fail with those ideas so that you can move on to the next one and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, Rufus, you have one more question for Michael?
Oh, I have like 12 that we didn't get to.
Go for it then.
Well, I don't know which one to go
You
for.
want to talk about fairness, I think. That was one of the things
Okay,
you were
yeah.
really
So
interested in.
your podcast for years has explored fairness in various different arenas, and I only know one industry well, and that's the sports betting industry. But whenever I talk to people in other industries, they basically say, "Oh yeah, my industry has all these same problems. Basically, like this isn't unique." And so I'm curious, how representative is the sports betting industry of sort of America as a whole, and do these systemic problems exist everywhere? And are there sort of any broad conclusions you've arrived at in your 5 years of sort of exploring fairness on your podcast?
So that's a big question.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't sure if I should ask
Yeah,
it.
no. So, but I'll answer it in a narrow way about the sport, about how representative the current sports gambling environment is of larger American fairness map. And and I'd say this: it is amazing to. It should be amazing to everybody that the society has allowed this predatory exploitative industry to sort of maximize its take from people from the weak and the poor, um, and exploit them every which way without anybody stopping and saying, really, should we be doing this? And I think that the reason FanDuel and DraftKings can run their businesses the way they're running their businesses right now is that it's not that far off from what goes on in a lot of American life. It feels like, this belongs here. And it's not just American life, but I mean, there are other countries where similar sorts of things happen. But it's the other side of this, it's no wonder that there's so much anger in the land about the world kind of being rigged. And it is but it is kind of amazing that at the same time there's this anger, there's an entire population that seems very happy running into rigged worlds when it's rigged against them, as opposed to just saying, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. I felt this subject was so good as a subject for a couple of reasons. One was that it was just how fast laws changed, and then norms changed about sports gambling. Like it was as if a prohibition ended, and then not only could you drink if you wanted to, you were almost like required. There was bottles were waved under your nose, and every alcoholic in the land was discovered and mined by the liquor companies, kind of thing. But the other thing that was interesting to me was it was just like the seeming total absence, or almost total absence, of cultural resistance to the industry. And I think the one explanation for why there's so low resistance is people have gotten kind of used to this sort of exploitative relationship, this kind of predatory relationship between companies and their customers. Anyway, I've never, you've probably gotten used to the outrage of people who know what they're doing being sort of sifted and removed from the marketplace, and people who shouldn't be doing it being encouraged to do it. But I still haven't gotten over it. I can't believe it. So I think it rhymed with the rest of the seasons in some way, because the rest of the seasons, it does. The touchstone theme in all the seasons, even though we can drift pretty far away from it, is fairness. And the reason we started in the very first season with this theme is I had a sense 6 years ago, whenever we started, that a lot of what's going on in the culture is rooted in feelings of unfairness. Like some things aren't fair in some way, and it really upsets people. That the anger that's alive and so alive in the land right now and so easily inflamed grows out of feelings of unfairness. So it was a way to explore that in lots of little ways. And this is a really good way to explore it. Do you think anything's getting, before we leave, I have a quick question for both of you. Do you think 5 years from now, we're going to look up and say, oh, it's amazing they let that happen, and this industry has been kind of corralled, and they had a moment when they were allowed to do stuff they shouldn't been allowed to do, but we kind of fixed it? Or do you think this is just the beginning of a big trend?
I'll go first. It feels like the beginning of a big trend. I don't know if that's the case or not, but if you look at what's going on, like the wild, wild west with like crypto, and it's just, there is so much more risk-seeking behavior and gambling going on. And I think it could go, I don't think it'll be where it is now. I think it'll go one of two directions. I just don't know which.
Yeah, I don't either. Me either. Jeff?
Well, I mean, the reason that Rufus and I argue about this sometimes is this has been happening to card counters since the beginning of time, right? Where they're treated, quote unquote, unfairly because they have a skill. They're not doing anything illegal. They've figured out how to beat the game. And it's something that I've had to learn to accept, that they get to make the rules and they get to be predatory. And I've said it all along, like they have magical roulette wheel signs to encourage people to take bad odds, and they do, like jackpots on slot machines and all this kind of stuff. And then when you have an opportunity to have a fair fight, or in this case, a slight edge in card counting, they tell you can't do it. So I think it's just the way this is. This is an industry that is built around them getting the best of it and the consumer getting the worst of it. And so that's just the rules of the game, unfortunately. And it's not a fair game. It's always been an unfair game. And it's some respects, it's sadly their prerogative because it's their business. And so that's just kind of my feeling on it. So.
Yeah. Which changes now. You don't have to go to Las Vegas and go to the trouble of going to a casino. You have it in your pocket.
Yeah, well, that's even worse, though, right? Because the accessibility and the ability for someone to now lose a bunch of money and also not have the thrill of like taking a guy's trip and going to a nice dinner and a club and a show and all, like it's now just this almost like sad sitting there, dopamine hit, losing, flipping a coin. Like if you went to someone and said, "I'm going to flip a coin. If it's tails, I'm going to pay you $1. If it's heads, you're going to pay me $1.10." No one would play that game, but then put a bunch of lights up and all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I'll play that game. So it's like this subterfuge and of unfairness. So
right.
Anyways, thanks, Michael, for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Yeah.
Totally fun.
Yeah, really fun. And we'll catch up with you again sometime.
And Rufus, if you want to write me any sweet texts about the meaning of our relationship, I'm still receptive.
Can you give a quick?
I feel like I have to wait for an obligatory period of time to pass first.
Give a quick thing on your podcast so everyone knows what it is and where to listen to it.
The podcast is called Against the Rules. The season that Rufus is featured in is the recent season 5. And you get it anywhere. Just my name and Against the Rules will pop up anywhere.
Okay. Thank you, Michael.
All right. See ya.